If you walk away now, you'll make it to your wedding on time." The words echoed across the crowded restaurant, but Aaliyah Brooks never even turned her head. She was already on her knees beside an elderly man whose face had gone pale, his trembling hands clutching helplessly at his throat as dinner conversations dissolved in a stunned silence. Crystal glasses caught the warm glow of the chandeliers. Soft jazz still drifted through the dining room, as if the world had not yet realized that a life was hanging by a thread. Plates sat untouched. Silverware rested in frozen hands. Every eye followed the young black waitress wearing a simple ivory dress beneath her serving apron, a dress that was never meant to be seen by restaurant guests. It was her wedding dress. In exactly 23 minutes, church bells across downtown Charleston would begin ringing for the ceremony she had dreamed about since she was a little girl. Her fiancé, Ethan Carter, would already be standing at the altar, checking his watch, smiling nervously, believing she was simply caught in traffic. Her bridesmaids would be fixing flowers. Her grandmother would be smoothing wrinkles from the front row ribbon. None of them knew that destiny had quietly rewritten the evening without asking anyone for permission. The old man gasped again, unable to speak. A terrified woman beside him fumbled with her phone while another guest shouted for someone to call 911. Several people stepped backward instead of forward, uncertain, frightened, hoping someone else would take responsibility. Aaliyah did not hesitate. Years of working double shifts had taught her something more valuable than carrying heavy trays or memorizing complicated orders. She had completed emergency response training after watching a customer collapse years earlier, promising herself that if another life ever depended on her, she would never stand frozen. Now that promise was being tested. She spoke gently, her voice steady despite the pounding of her own heart. "Sir, stay with me. You're going to be okay." Around her, whispers spread like ripples across still water. Someone noticed the white satin beneath her uniform. Someone else pointed toward the bouquet resting near the hostess stand, wrapped carefully in tissue paper beside a pair of elegant heels, waiting for the moment her shift officially ended. Another guest quietly asked, "Isn't she supposed to be getting married today?" The answer traveled from table to table until the entire restaurant seemed to breathe the same question. Why was the bride still here? Outside, the late afternoon sun painted golden reflections across parked cars, and a vintage wedding limousine waited patiently in the employee parking lot, its driver glancing at his watch every few moments. Inside, time felt strangely suspended. Every second stretched longer than the one before it. Every heartbeat seemed louder than the music. Aaliyah focused only on the frightened stranger before her, refusing to let panic steal her concentration. She knew exactly what she stood to lose, yet not once did she look toward the exit. Some moments divide a person's life into before and after. This was one of them. Before anyone in that dining room learned the old man's name, before the church realized the bride would never arrive on schedule, before a convoy of black SUVs would quietly roll into Charleston less than 24 hours later, one simple act of compassion had already begun changing lives in ways no amount of wealth could ever predict. Aaliyah counted slowly under her breath, blocking out every sound except the uneven breathing in front of her. The frightened guests faded into the background. The ringing phones, the hurried footsteps, the nervous whispers, none of it mattered. She remembered the emergency instructor who had once looked an entire room of restaurant employees in the eye and said, "When everyone else freezes, someone has to decide." She had never imagined that someone would be her while wearing the dress she planned to say yes in forever. She acted with calm precision, encouraging the elderly man to keep fighting as several restaurant employees cleared space around them. A young server knelt beside her, ready to help if she needed another pair of hands. Moments later, the old man's body relaxed as his breathing finally steadied. A cough broke the silence, followed by another. The entire dining room seemed to exhale together. Someone quietly applauded before realizing how inappropriate applause felt for a moment that had nearly ended in tragedy. Tears filled the eyes of the elderly woman sitting beside him as she reached for his hand. "Thank you," she whispered over and over, unable to say anything else. Aaliyah smiled softly, more relieved than proud. He's going to be okay. The paramedics will want to examine him anyway. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder outside. Red and blue emergency lights reflected across the restaurant windows, painting brief flashes over polished wood floors and crystal chandeliers. Two paramedics entered carrying equipment with practiced confidence, immediately checking the older gentleman's condition while asking quick, reassuring questions. Aaliyah quietly stepped aside, suddenly aware that her hands were trembling. The rush of adrenaline was beginning to fade. One of the paramedics looked toward her after hearing several witnesses explain what had happened. "You did exactly the right thing," he said with genuine respect. "You probably made all the difference today." She nodded politely, almost embarrassed by the attention. Across the room, her manager hurried over, his expression caught somewhere between pride and concern. "Aaliyah," he said gently, "your phone has been ringing for the last 15 minutes. He handed her the device she had left charging behind the hostess stand. The screen lit up instantly. 12 missed calls from Ethan. From messages from her maid of honor. 7 more from family members. One voicemail, after another waiting to be heard. At the top of the screen, the time seemed impossible. 20 minutes past the start of the ceremony. She stared without speaking. Her bouquet still rested exactly where she had left it. Fresh white roses tied with a blue ribbon her grandmother had sewn by hand weeks earlier. The limousine driver had sent a single text before leaving. "I waited as long as I could. I hope everything is all right." A lump formed in her throat, but she forced herself to remain composed. There would be time for tears later. Right now, the elderly gentleman was being carefully placed onto a stretcher. Before the paramedics wheeled him toward the ambulance, he reached weakly toward her. His fingers barely brushed her hand, but his eyes spoke more clearly than words ever could. Gratitude, relief, and something else she could not quite identify. Almost as though he wanted to tell her something important before exhaustion pulled him away again. Then he was gone. The ambulance doors closed. The flashing lights disappeared into the evening traffic. Aaliyah stood alone beneath the restaurant entrance, still wearing her wedding dress beneath a plain black apron. Watching the empty street where her wedding day had quietly slipped away, never once realizing that somewhere across the city, a phone had just begun ringing inside the executive office of Jonathan Whitmore, and the conversation that followed would set events in a motion that no one present could possibly imagine. The drive across Charleston felt longer than any journey Aaliyah had ever taken. She changed out of her restaurant apron in the employee restroom, smoothing the wrinkles from her wedding dress with trembling hands before climbing into her aging sedan. White satin rested against worn fabric seats that had carried her through years of double shifts, grocery runs, and late-night drives home after closing the restaurant. The bouquet lay quietly beside her, no longer the centerpiece of a celebration, but a silent reminder of promises waiting across town. Every red light seemed to linger forever. Every passing minute pressed heavier against her chest. Her phone remained on the passenger's seat, vibrating every few moments before finally falling silent. She knew Ethan had stopped calling, and somehow that hurt more than hearing another missed ringtone. Outside, Charleston glowed beneath the warm colors of early evening. Couples laughed on sidewalks. Families strolled beneath rows of old oak trees draped with Spanish moss. Horse-drawn carriages rolled past historic churches where wedding photographers captured smiling brides beginning futures they had planned for months. Aaliyah could not stop wondering if her own photographer had already packed away the cameras. When she finally pulled into the church parking lot, the answer greeted her before she even stepped outside. The vintage limousine was gone. Most of the guests had already left. White flower petals scattered across the brick walkway, drifting gently with the coastal breeze. The front doors of the church remained open, but the joyful sounds she had imagined hearing were replaced by quiet echoes inside the nearly empty sanctuary. She gathered her bouquet, inhaled deeply, and walked through the entrance with careful steps that somehow felt heavier than anything she had carried during years of restaurant work. The candles near the altar still flickered softly. Fresh flowers filled the room with their sweet fragrance, untouched by the disappointment hanging in the air. Ethan stood alone near the front pews, his tuxedo still perfectly pressed, his hands resting loosely at his sides. His best man quietly slipped out through a side door after noticing her arrival, leaving the two of them alone beneath stained glass windows glowing with the last light of the day. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Ethan looked at her dress, then at the bouquet she still held, before his eyes settled gently on her face. There was no anger there, only confusion, exhaustion, and the quiet sadness that follows a day no one can ever repeat. Finally, Aaliyah found her voice. "I am so sorry." The words barely escaped above a whisper. Tears threatened to rise, but she fought to keep them back. Ethan took a slow breath before answering. "I heard what happened." She blinked in surprise. "Some guests from the restaurant posted videos online. One of my cousins recognized you. They called while everyone here was still waiting." He looked down briefly before continuing. "They said you stayed to save a stranger." Aaliyah lowered her eyes, unable to explain the impossible choice she had faced because no explanation could return the hours they had lost. Ethan walked a few steps closer until only the bouquet separated them. "I kept hoping the church doors would open and you would walk in smiling," he admitted quietly. "Then I realized someone else needed you more than I did." His voice carried no bitterness, only the weight of accepting a reality neither of them had expected. Before Aaliyah could answer, the church doors opened once again. An unfamiliar man in a dark business suit stepped inside, carrying a small leather folder. He scanned the nearly empty sanctuary before his eyes settled on Aaliyah. "Excuse me," he said respectfully. "Are you Miss Aaliyah Brooks? I have been searching for you since the hospital called, and I believe this message cannot wait until tomorrow." The stranger waited patiently until the silence settled. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that carried none of the flashiness of expensive fashion, only the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to serious conversations. His silver tie was perfectly straight despite what had clearly been a long evening, and a discreet lapel pin bearing the initials W.C. caught the light for only a moment before disappearing beneath the folds of his jacket. He held the leather folder carefully, almost as though it contained something far more valuable than paper. "My name is Daniel Mercer," he said with a respectful nod. "I serve as executive counsel for Whitmore Capital." Ethan glanced toward Aaliyah with a puzzled expression. Neither of them recognized the company name immediately, but Daniel seemed unsurprised. "Mr. Harold Bennett asked us to find a young woman who helped him today. We have been searching every emergency room, every restaurant, and every witness statement for the past several hours." Aaliyah blinked in confusion. "Mr. Bennett is awake?" Daniel smiled for the first time. "Yes, Miss Brooks. He insisted that the first thing we do was locate you." Relief washed over her face. She had spent the entire drive wondering whether the elderly man had recovered, carrying a burden she had never spoken aloud. Knowing he was safe made everything else seem slightly lighter, even if her wedding day had slipped away. Daniel opened the folder and removed a single handwritten note folded neatly in half. "He was unable to travel tonight, but he asked me to personally deliver this." Aaliyah accepted the note with careful hands. The elegant handwriting trembled, slightly across the cream-colored stationery. "To the young lady who chose my life over her own celebration. I do not yet know your story, but I know your character. Some debts cannot be repaid with words. Please allow my family the opportunity to thank you properly. Harold Bennett." She read the message twice before looking up. "That is very kind, but there is no debt. Anyone would have helped." Daniel's expression softened. "Miss Brooks, with respect, not everyone did." The words lingered quietly inside the nearly empty church. She remembered the frozen faces inside the restaurant, the uncertain steps backward, the hesitation that had filled the room before she acted. Daniel continued carefully. "Mr. Bennett has spent his entire life believing that character reveals itself when there is nothing to gain. Today you proved him right." Ethan rested a gentle hand on Aaliyah's shoulder, his eyes moving between her and the letter. For the first time that evening, a faint smile appeared on his face. "You always told me that kindness has a way of finding its way back," he said softly, Maybe this is what you meant. Aaliyah shook her head with quiet humility. I was not looking for anything in return. Exactly, Daniel replied. That is precisely why Mr. Bennett refuses to let this end with a thank you. He reached into the folder once more and handed her a simple white business card embossed only with a name and direct phone number. There was no company logo on the front, only one line beneath the name. Jonathan Whitmore, President and Chief Executive Officer. Daniel noticed their uncertainty and added calmly, Mr. Whitmore is Mr. Bennett's son. Before either of them could respond, the church doors opened once again. Outside, the low rumble of engines echoed through the quiet evening. Several identical black sport utility vehicles rolled slowly into the nearly empty parking lot, their headlights sweeping across the church walls before coming to a graceful stop. No flashing lights, no commotion, just a silent arrival that somehow commanded attention. Daniel glanced toward the entrance and offered a small smile. It appears he decided waiting until tomorrow was simply not an option. The church doors opened slowly as cool evening air drifted through the sanctuary, carrying with it the quiet hum of expensive engines now resting outside beneath rows of towering oak trees. Aaliyah turned instinctively toward the entrance, still clutching Harold Bennett's handwritten note against her bouquet. One by one, several men and women stepped inside, each dressed with understated elegance rather than unnecessary display. They were not bodyguards creating a spectacle. They moved with calm professionalism, allowing one final figure to enter without hurry. Jonathan Whitmore looked nothing like the business magazines that occasionally appeared on the restaurant's waiting room table. At 41, the white billionaire carried himself with remarkable restraint. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly, yet nothing about him demanded attention. Instead, it was the expression on his face that quietly transformed the room. He was not smiling. He was not projecting authority. He looked like a son who had almost lost his father. For several seconds, he simply stood there, taking in the nearly empty church, the scattered flower petals across the aisle, the untouched wedding decorations, and finally the young black waitress, still wearing the wedding dress she had never been given the chance to walk down the aisle in. His eyes lingered on the bouquet before returning to her face. "Miss Brooks?" he asked softly. Aaliyah nodded without speaking. Jonathan walked forward alone, leaving everyone else respectfully behind. When he reached her, he extended his hand. "Jonathan Whitmore, I owe you more than I can ever explain." She accepted the handshake with quiet humility. "Your father is safe. That is enough for me." Jonathan released a slow breath that sounded almost like relief. "You have no idea how important those words are." He glanced briefly toward Ethan before continuing. "The doctors told me another minute could have changed everything. My father has always insisted on eating without security whenever he wanted to feel like an ordinary citizen. Today that decision nearly cost me the only parent I have left." His voice remained steady, but gratitude settled into every word. He looked around the sanctuary once more before asking gently, "Did your ceremony?" He stopped himself after noticing the empty pews. He already knew the answer. Ethan stepped forward first. "She never made it here because she chose to save someone else." Jonathan lowered his eyes for a brief moment. "Then today my family received a miracle at the cost of yours." The sentence hung in the stillness with unexpected weight. No one rushed to fill the silence. Finally, Aaliyah spoke. "Please do not think that way. We can choose another wedding date. Your father only has one life." Jonathan studied her face carefully, almost searching for resentment, disappointment, or regret. He found none. That realization seemed to affect him more deeply than any speech could have. "My father spent my entire childhood teaching me that wealth measures success, but character measures a person," he said quietly. "Tonight you reminded me why he never stopped repeating that lesson." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, but paused before removing anything. Instead, he looked toward Ethan. "May I ask you one question?" Ethan nodded. Jonathan smiled faintly. "Do you still want to marry her?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "More than I did this morning." For the first time all evening, genuine warmth crossed Jonathan's face. He looked back at Aaliyah before saying, Good. Because I believe this wedding deserves a beginning that honors the choice you made today. And if you will allow me, my family would like to make that happen in a way neither of you will ever forget. Aaliyah exchanged a quiet glance with Ethan before looking back at Jonathan. You do not owe us anything, she said sincerely. I only did what I hoped someone would do for the people I love. Jonathan nodded slowly, almost expecting that answer. That is exactly what my father said you would tell me. A faint smile appeared as he continued. He warned me that you would probably refuse anything that felt like a reward. Daniel Mercer lowered his eyes, hiding a knowing smile. Clearly this conversation had been anticipated long. His jacket once again, and this time removed a slim navy envelope sealed with a silver crest. He held it out, but did not insist that she take it. This is not payment, he explained calmly. My father would be deeply disappointed if anyone tried to reduce what happened today to a transaction. Consider this an invitation. Curious, Aaliyah accepted the envelope and carefully opened it. Inside rested a single card printed on thick cream paper. It invited her and Ethan to breakfast the following morning at the Whitmore estate. No reporters, no cameras, no executives, only Harold Bennett, Jonathan Whitmore, and their closest family members. At the bottom, written in Harold's unmistakable handwriting, was one simple sentence. Please give an old man the chance to thank the young woman who reminded him that goodness still exists. Aaliyah looked up with surprised eyes. You want us to come to your home? Jonathan answered immediately. Not because of who I am, because of who you are. Ethan squeezed her hand gently, sensing the sincerity behind every word. Before either of them could respond, the church custodian quietly approached from the back of the sanctuary carrying a small cardboard box. Miss Brooks, the elderly woman, said kindly, I was about to lock up, but I thought these belonged to you. Inside the box were the wedding favors carefully prepared by Aaliyah herself. Small glass jars filled with homemade peach preserves, each tied with blue ribbon and a handwritten tag that read, Love grows when it is shared. Jonathan picked up one jar and studied the handwritten label for several seconds. You made all of these yourself. She smiled modestly. Over several weekends. My grandmother taught me the recipe. Jonathan slowly turned the jar in his hands before speaking almost to himself. People spend fortunes trying to create something meaningful. Sometimes meaning comes from things money cannot buy. He carefully placed the jar back into the box, exactly where he had found it. Then he turned toward Daniel. Tomorrow morning, I want every florist, baker, musician, photographer, and planner who worked on today's ceremony contacted personally. If they have availability, I would like them all back. Aaliyah quickly interrupted. Please, you do not have to do that. Jonathan met her eyes with quiet respect rather than authority. No, I do not have to. He paused before adding gently, I want to. His answer carried no trace of obligation, only gratitude. The church had grown almost completely dark now, except for soft lights near the altar, casting long reflections across polished wooden pews. Outside, the breeze stirred loose flower petals across the front steps, as though refusing to let the celebration disappear entirely. Jonathan walked toward the sanctuary doors before stopping one final time. Without turning around, he spoke in a calm voice that echoed softly through the empty church. My father often says that the truest measure of a person's life is not how many people recognize their name, but how many strangers are alive because they chose to care. Miss Brooks, tomorrow you will discover why everyone who knows Harold Bennett understands that when he says thank you, he never forgets what those words truly mean. The next morning arrived with the quiet confidence of a day that seemed determined to rewrite the ending of the one before it. As the first rays of sunlight stretched across Charleston Harbor, Aaliyah and Ethan drove through a pair of iron gates that opened without a sound. Beyond them, the Whitmore estate unfolded across rolling green hills bordered by towering magnolia trees and centuries-old oaks. The property was breathtaking, yet nothing about it felt designed to impress strangers. It felt lived in, welcoming, peaceful. Aaliyah noticed children riding bicycles along a winding path, while gardeners greeted each other by name. Employees waved as Jonathan crossed the courtyard on foot, carrying 2 cups of coffee instead of issuing instructions from behind tinted windows. It was not the image she had imagined of one of America's most successful billionaire chief executive officers. Jonathan met them at the front steps, wearing a light blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. No security surrounded him. No cameras followed him. "Thank you for coming," he said warmly. "My father has been asking every 15 minutes whether you had arrived yet." Inside, sunlight poured through enormous windows overlooking gardens bursting with summer flowers. Family photographs covered the walls instead of expensive artwork. There were pictures of fishing trips, birthday parties, graduation ceremonies, and one faded black and white photograph showing a young Harold Bennett standing beside a tiny grocery store with a handwritten sign that read, "Bennett Family Market." Jonathan noticed Aaliyah studying the picture. "That little store was everything my grandparents owned," he explained. "My father stocked shelves before school and swept the floors after homework. He never forgot where he started, no matter how successful our family became." Before Aaliyah could respond, a familiar voice echoed from the dining room. "There she is." Harold Bennett rose slowly from his chair, looking noticeably stronger than the day before. The warmth in his smile erased the remaining distance between them. Without hesitation, Aaliyah crossed the room and gently embraced him. Harold chuckled softly. "Now I know the doctors were right. They said the young lady who saved me would probably ask how I was before accepting my thanks." She smiled through misty eyes. "I was worried about you." Harold patted her hand affectionately. "And I've been grateful for you since the moment I woke up." Breakfast had already been prepared, but before anyone reached for a plate, Harold quietly stood again. The room naturally fell silent. He looked first at Jonathan, then at Ethan, and finally back to Aaliyah. "Yesterday, my son asked me how he could ever repay the woman who saved my life," Harold began. "I told him he was asking the wrong question." He paused just long enough for everyone to lean in. "Kindness should never be purchased. It should be multiplied." Jonathan nodded gently, having clearly heard these words before. Harold continued, "If one act of compassion can save a stranger, imagine what thousands of acts could do." He reached beside his chair and lifted a simple leather portfolio. There were no dramatic gestures, only quiet purpose. Sliding it across the table toward Aaliyah, he smiled with grandfatherly warmth. "Inside is not a gift for yesterday. It is an opportunity for every tomorrow that follows. I hope you will read it before deciding whether my family has truly thanked you, because what you inspired last night has already begun changing far more lives than either of us could have imagined." Aaliyah looked down at the leather portfolio with quiet curiosity before carefully opening it. Inside, she did not find a check, a property deed, or anything that resembled a personal reward. Instead, the first page carried a simple title in bold letters: "The Brooks Bennett Kindness Initiative." She frowned slightly, uncertain she had read it correctly. Harold smiled as Jonathan slid another document across the table. "Last night my father could not stop talking about one sentence," Jonathan explained. "He kept saying that the young woman who saved him never asked who he was. She only saw someone who needed help. We realized that if one stranger could change a life without expecting recognition, perhaps our family had been thinking too small for too long." Aaliyah slowly turned another page. The proposal described a charitable foundation that would provide emergency response training, scholarships for hospitality workers, and financial assistance for restaurant employees facing unexpected family emergencies. Every program centered on one idea: ordinary people should have the chance to become extraordinary helpers before a crisis ever arrived. Her eyes widened as she reached the final page. At the bottom, beneath Harold Bennett's signature and Jonathan Whitmore's signature, one space remained blank. Above it were the words, "Founding Chair, Aaliyah Brooks." She immediately looked up. "There has to be some mistake." Harold shook his head gently. "There is not." She pushed the folder slightly back across the table. "I have never managed a foundation. I'm only a waitress." Jonathan smiled, not with amusement, but with complete confidence. "Yesterday you managed something much harder. You made the right decision when nobody could promise you it would work out. Leadership begins there. Ethan quietly reached for her hand beneath the table. He knew exactly what she was thinking. She had spent years believing that people with important titles changed communities, while people like her simply worked long hours to pay bills. Harold leaned forward with the patience of a grandfather, sharing wisdom rather than instructions. Young lady, titles do not create character. Character gives meaning to titles. We already have attorneys, accountants, executives, and advisors. What we cannot hire is the heart that inspired this entire idea. The room fell comfortably silent. Outside the dining room windows, several children laughed as they chased one another across the lawn. A gardener paused to help a little girl retrieve a kite tangled in low tree branches before returning to his work with a smile. Aaliyah watched this simple moment unfold. Kindness. Quiet. Unnoticed. Exactly like the choice she had made inside the restaurant. Jonathan followed her gaze. My father built businesses for decades, he said softly. He always hoped one day they would become a platform for something greater than profits. Yesterday, you showed us what that greater purpose should look like. Aaliyah lowered her eyes again toward the empty signature line. She still felt unworthy of everything unfolding before her. If I agree, she asked carefully, can we make one promise? Harold answered immediately. Name it. She took a slow breath. No advertisements with my face. No speeches about me. If this foundation exists, let honor every server, cashier, janitor, delivery driver, nurse, teacher, and stranger who quietly helps someone because it is the right thing to do. Not because anyone is watching. Harold's eyes glistened with emotion as he looked proudly toward his son. Jonathan gave a slow nod before extending a fountain pen across the table. Miss Brooks, he said with unmistakable respect. That answer tells me we invited exactly the right person. Aaliyah accepted the fountain pen with both hands, not because the signature itself felt important, but because she understood what it represented. She carefully wrote her name beneath Harold Bennett's and Jonathan Whitmore's, then quietly returned the pen to the table. No one applauded. No cameras appeared. The moment did not need an audience. It only needed witnesses who understood that something meaningful had just begun. Harold smiled with unmistakable pride before standing once more. Now, he said with a spark of joy in his eyes, there remains one problem that this old man refuses to ignore. Ethan laughed softly. I think I know which problem you mean. Harold pointed playfully toward the couple. Yesterday, a bride chose to save my life instead of walking down the aisle. Today, I would like the privilege of helping her finish what she started. Jonathan glanced at Daniel Mercer, who immediately nodded as though waiting for the signal all along. Within minutes, staff members began quietly entering the dining room, carrying clipboards, flower samples, seating charts, and calendars. Jonathan turned toward Aaliyah with an easy smile. Every florist, musician, photographer, baker, and minister from yesterday has agreed to return this Saturday. Nobody accepted additional payment. When they heard why the ceremony was postponed, every single one volunteered to come back. Aaliyah covered her mouth in disbelief. All of them. Every last one, Daniel confirmed. Several guests who left yesterday also asked whether they could attend again. They said they wanted to witness the wedding after learning why it never happened. Ethan looked at Aaliyah with the same expression he had worn the day he proposed. I told you yesterday that I wanted to marry you even more than before. I guess now an entire community feels the same way. For days later, the little church looked almost exactly as it had before, yet everything felt different. The flowers seemed brighter. The music sounded warmer. The pews were completely filled, not only with family and friends, but also with restaurant employees, paramedics, neighbors, and several strangers who had quietly become part of the story. Harold Bennett waited near the entrance wearing a simple gray suit, holding the bouquet that had rested untouched beside the hostess stand only days earlier. As Aaliyah stepped out of the bridal room, Harold offered his arm with gentle dignity. Would you allow an old man, who received a second chance, to walk you toward your new beginning? Tears shimmered in her eyes as she nodded. Together they walked slowly down the aisle while Ethan waited beneath the stained glass windows, smiling through grateful tears of his own. Jonathan remained seated quietly among the guests. He did not stand at the front. He did not make a speech. He simply watched with the contentment of a son who still had his father because one stranger had refused to look away. After the ceremony ended and joyful laughter filled the church courtyard, Harold gathered everyone for one final photograph. Before the camera flashed, he looked toward Aaliyah and spoke words that no one present would ever forget. You believed you missed your wedding because you stopped to save a stranger. The truth is that your kindness did not delay your future. It revealed it. The crowd grew still. Even the children seemed to pause. Jonathan looked toward the foundation documents resting safely inside his briefcase and quietly realized that his family's greatest investment would never appear on a financial statement. It would be measured in lives changed by people who chose compassion over convenience. As the afternoon sun settled gently across Charleston, one simple truth remained long after the music faded and the flowers were carried home. Wealth can open doors. Power can command attention. But only kindness leaves behind a legacy that strangers are willing to carry forward.